everyone. Nice to see you again. Like the meal that you have. I got to kind of monitor what I eat because I'm just not used to eating on a full stomach and then teaching. So Kathleen set me up with some chicken to take home, and I picked on a few things while I'm here. It's perfect. Well, I don't know if you had known from last week, but I have notes if that means anything to you, and I will send it to John, every Thursday. And if you want notes, if you want to study more, or go through back some of the things I said, they're available for you.
I did announce Sunday, but I do have last week's bill.
Yeah.
Anyone who wants to give me their email address, I'll forward you last week's notes. I'll forward this week's notes.
I know there's a door I want to do.
It's all being taped.
Oh, is it all being taped as well?
You can go on PeterCreekBaptistChurch.org and click on latest sermons, and you can hit Wednesday, last Sunday, so it would be the second one down right now. We had last Sunday, and we had Wednesday before, and then of course after tonight, your meeting gets closed on by people that are the afternoon for that.
Great.
Welcome to go online and watch it, and have it stuff.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, when you read the story of Joseph out of Genesis, it doesn't take long to see that God is very, very aware of all of the experiences of our life, the trials, the things that don't make sense, the promises that He's given to us that He will continue to fulfill, sometimes much later in life, though. So like I said last time, the story of Joseph is Romans 8:28 in living color. Romans 8:28 is a divine principle. Joseph is probably the best example of someone that lives out this principle of God's providence. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose, for whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be born in the image of His Son or of God. The interesting thing about Romans 28, though, is that all things work together for good for them that love God and those that are called according to His purpose. So the good that He's working out in life, our life, and the good that we see He's working out in Joseph's life and for his family's life, is what He deems as good and brings Him honor, not necessarily what we call good. In other words, you would say, well, I'm not the best at managing my money, and I've gotten in a lot of debt, but God will bail me out. It'll work out. Well, it eventually will work out, but it may not feel that it's for your good. So we always got to remember that His providence, the way He engineers our life, the way He allows things to happen in our life, good, bad, or indifferent, it follows His purpose for us, and His purpose for us is to be conformed into the image of Jesus. So that's the goal, that whatever you and I go through, it conforms us to the image of Christ. It doesn't mean that all of our physical pain goes away. It doesn't mean that our checkbook makes sense. It doesn't mean like we'll get all the answers to the prayers we have right away. It just means that it will fulfill His purpose. So, last week, so I have a title for this message. It's called, It Just So Happened. It just so happened. There is no such thing as a coincidence in terms of God's work for his people. There's no such thing as luck. There's no such thing as throwing the dice or karma. God has a specific purpose and plan for all of us, and sometimes it involves affliction and suffering. Many times. I mean, that's no secret in the New Testament. Matter of fact, the New Testament holds up trials and suffering as more of an honor than a curse, actually. You really want to get right to it. So it just so happened, though, like the Lord is always at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing when we need it the most. We'll see that in the life of Joseph. So last week we left off observing a family that was so dysfunctional and divided. The interesting thing about that was this was God's chosen patriarchal family in the Old Testament. These are the best of the best, right? Wrong. So we see the 12 patriarchs and Joseph and Jacob and Isaac a little bit earlier on and Abraham a little bit earlier on. All of them are flawed. All of them are sinners. And boy, do we see this in Joseph's family. Joseph had 10 half-brothers. Well, 9 half-brothers. Benjamin, the youngest one, was his biological brother. 9 half-brothers. We talked about that last week. Blended families are not easy. They take a lot of effort, a lot of work. So he had 9 half-brothers that were agitated with him from early on. Anybody remember why? Well, that was one thing that we covered. We see it in verse 3, that in his dreams, turning a bad report. That's, yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah. 17. So it started off with everything he just said. He brought a bad report about his brothers to his father. Now, as we get through this text today, you're going to see that it's pretty clear that Jacob didn't trust the other 9. Pretty clear. And Joseph was his favorite. It actually says, but Jacob loved Joseph more than his brothers. And then the next verse says, and so they hated Joseph more. So we had a nice little counseling session last week. For those of you who are parents and grandparents or great-grandparents, not to show favoritism to any of your children or grandchildren. You may feel that your darling is close to you and cuddly, and the other ones are more prickly and don't touch me. Love them the same. You could feel different in your heart. Love them the same. Because when we found out that he loved Joseph more than the other 9 brothers, the Bible says they couldn't say a kind word to their brother. So it's not like they were angry at their father. They were angry at Joseph. So they brought a bad report. He made the almost unforgivable mistake of loving Joseph more than all the other siblings. And then he had the audacity, the father, to let Joseph wear the coat of many colors. Now, the coat of many colors, as I said last week, was a long-sleeved coat. It was a coat that went to the ground, more like a robe, so to speak. But it was only reserved for the eldest brother. Joseph was the second to the youngest. It was a coat of management and leadership. And he didn't give it to Reuben. Now, I think we're going to find, though, that Reuben, in chapter 35, the eldest son, the one that was supposed to be revered and his father's successor, in chapter 35, he actually slept with one of his other mothers, Bilhah, which was one of his father's wives. You might say that serves him right. He should only have one wife. And so the other thing that's interesting about that is Jacob did nothing about it. Nothing. It says, and so Reuben slept with Bilhah, Jacob's wife. And keep in mind this, Jacob's grieving over the death of his favorite wife, right? Rachel or Rebecca? I'm drawing a blank. Rachel. Yeah. And his son sleeps with one of his other wives while his father's still grieving from the loss of his favorite wife. These boys were heartless. We're going to see that tonight. Heartless. Well, they learned it from their father. Yeah. I mean, Jacob's name means deceiver. His very name means deceiver. There was deceivers all through that family. And favorites that they had. And we're going to find later in the text that Joseph even had a little issue with that with a couple of his sons too. So you know how we hand down traditions and even dysfunction, right? So they hated him because of the bad report. They hated him because his father loved him more than anyone else. They hated him because he got the coat of leadership when he was one of the youngest sons. And they hated him especially, what was the last one? His dreams. He had 2 dreams, and that's okay. We're going to find out later in the book of Genesis that God gave him a gift of visions and dreams. Be careful for those dreams, though, as something to really rely your future on. God can speak to us in dreams, but it's not his standard. I've often said when I teach youth groups, go easy on the pizza that you eat late at night, because you might start having visions of what you think God wants you to do. So go easy on those dreams. I think the Lord, I was seeking his will one time when I was a pastor in Eureka. We had a choice of which office to get, and I was really torn. I was a very young green pastor, and I said, oh Lord, just show us. And I dreamt that night of the building that we actually got. I mean, that's one time in 47 years, so be careful about these dreams. Nevertheless, Joseph had a gift of visions and dreams. His problem was what, though? What was his problem regarding his dreams? He shared it with his brothers. And his dreams were about his superiority and their future. And they were incensed. I don't know if Jacob was there during the first dream. I don't know if he was, because it mentioned specifically that he was there in the second dream with his wife, and he said, Joseph, you're talking foolishness. You're talking about the sun and the moon and the stars, the 11 stars that are going to bow down to you. Are you saying that I represent the moon and your mother the sun and your mother represents the moon, and our brothers are the 11 stars, and we're going to bow down to you? Joseph. But look at verse 11 in chapter 37. We read then, and his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept that saying in mind. Is there another verse in the Bible where that says something similar, but the individual kept the saying in mind? Mary, mother of Jesus, when the angel told her that she was going to be the virgin mother. But she kept this saying in mind. Very interesting. So the father held on to it. He knew there was something significant about this boy. Something very, very special about this boy. And he kept it in mind. But look at the next part of the verse. And his brothers were jealous of him. Jealous of him. Jealousy is a very, very vicious sin. What we're going to see tonight, I have something to read to you about jealousy, but what we're going to see tonight is their jealousy would eventually morph into extreme hatred, rage, and even the desire to murder. So jealousy grows with time. I've counseled with many couples where one of the spouses were always jealous and the marriage didn't last. It's vicious. This is from Chuck Swindoll on jealousy. I just want to read a little portion to you. Like an anger-blind, half-starved rat prowling in the foul-smelling sewers below street level, so is the person caged within the suffocating radius of selfish jealousy. Trapped by the resentment and diseased by rage, he feeds on the filth of his own imagination. There's good Proverbs here. Proverbs says jealousy enrages a man. He continues, Song of Solomon, jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire. So, I'll read just a little bit more, but just know this, of your own life, of someone else's life, and some of you know that's really insecure, only the grace of God can free us from jealousy. It's a disease, and it's deadly. He goes on, anyone who has experienced deliverance from this hellish giant knows only too well the savagery of its seizure. Jealousy, now think about your own life, where jealousy has touched your own life. Jealousy will decimate a friendship, dissolve a romance, destroy a marriage. It will shoot tension through the ranks of the professionals. It will nullify unity on a team. It will ruin a church. It will separate preachers. It will foster competition in a choir, bring bitterness and finger-pointing among talented instrumentalists and capable singers. With squint eyes, the giant of jealousy will question motives and deplore another's successes. It will become severe, suspicious, and negative. I know what I'm saying, Chuck Swindoll, the great Chuck Swindoll says, ask my wife. And so this jealousy was not contained in his brother's life. And we're going to see tonight, how it did eventuate in rage and conspiracy to murder their brother. It began with jealousy and hatred. We see in verse 12 through 17, let's read that together now. Verse 12 through 17. Now his brothers want to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel, or Jacob, Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now and see if it's well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. This tells me that he didn't trust them very well, but it also tells me that he was a little bit protective of the boys out there. They were ages 20 through 30, Joseph's older brothers, because it was in Shechem that they had a tremendous problem. I think it's in Shechem where Reuben slept with his stepmother. And he was concerned that there was going to be some problems. And so he sends his son to go out and bring a report back from them. But like I said last week, I think what we have in Jacob was a very, very passive father. He did nothing when he found out his son slept with his wife. And now, kind of like we talked about last week, he sends this innocent boy, foolishly 17, but innocent and pure of heart, out to go with these brothers. He has to know that they hate him. He was there when Joseph shared his dreams. And they were vehement about what he just said. He had to know it. But he sends his 17-year-old out among the wolves. So he was a very passive father. And by the way, passivity in a home will kill a home. Passivity in marriage will end in divorce, where, especially for a spiritual leader like us men, we don't step up. We don't set an example. We don't draw a line. Not good. I think I mentioned last week that one author said that passivity is one of the number one causes for divorce in America, where one of the people are passive, and specifically men. And so he sends him out there, and he wants to get a report. He says, bring me back word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. 50-mile trip on feet. 50 miles. Took 6 to 7 days. Now, look at the contrast between his sons, who are about getting ready to throw Joseph down a pit, and lie to their father for 20 years about his death. Look at that contrast versus the contrast of Joseph. He says, here I am, Father. I will go. Look at the difference. You have a group of sons that lie to their father, to give a rip about what he says, really struggle with his favoritism towards Joseph. And then you have Joseph that knowingly goes into a dangerous situation because his father asked him to. Interesting. He willingly submits. Let's read on. So Joseph's on his trip now. In verse 15, and a man found Joseph wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? So, there's fields there. His brothers have taken flocks. They're working the fields. They're going to try to feed the sheep in the fields. The father sent him to those particular fields in Shechem. And so this farmer, or maybe herder himself, sheep herder himself, sees this young man just wandering around like he's lost in his fields. He says, well, what are you looking for? What are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, it's very interesting, they have gone away, for I heard them say, he overheard them say, let's go to Dothan, another 15 miles away. This is a 65-mile trip. Now let's stop right here. We've said from moment one in Joseph's life that God was in control of his past, present, and future. God was in control. God was even in control and aware that he was favored. He was aware that Joseph would be foolish with his dreams. He was aware that his brothers hated him and were jealous of him and inwardly wanted him dead. And he's also aware that there's a man that owns property there in Shechem who would overhear where the men went next. And so he said, well, they just went that way. You ever had that happen to you? I mean, all the time as believers. Well, or there's a concern, or maybe you're struggling financially, or you want to resolve a conflict, and the next thing you know, it's right there in front of you. Providence of God. And so the Lord is in this. The Lord wants Joseph to get in this situation where they actually throw him in the pit. Now, please understand, God has nothing to do with evil. James says that, the book of the James. God has nothing to do with evil, nor will he be tempted by evil. But God will use evil, and by the time he puts it in his providence hand, he spins it, changes us as a result of having evil happen to us, and it becomes his will. So he's behind this whole thing. And Joseph knows where to go now. Let's continue. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. By the way, that place is still there. I've been to Israel 3 times, but the first time we went was in 1982. And one of our Bible college professors was an archaeologist. He was a nice, cool guy to walk around with. And he took us up on this mound. It was called the city of Dothan. So you know, in the Middle East or other ancient places, the way they used to build their cities was on the foundation of the last city that was destroyed by the enemy. So they would build cities and cities and cities on top of them. They're called tells, T-E-Ls, which means there's several layers of civilization and ruins under there. And when we went to Dothan, it was a big mound, and there were pieces of pottery, broken pieces of pottery, some that still had the color enamel on them. I picked up one piece, and I asked the professor, how far does this date back? He said the time of Elijah. Amazing. These places are still there. So he went to Dothan, verse 18, and they saw him from afar. How do you think they recognized it was Joseph? You're a pretty sharp crowd. He was wearing that loud, exaggerated, baggy, long sleeve robe of many colors, which was the very reason they hated him. And so when they saw Joseph coming from afar, they knew it was him. Gave him time to conspire and scheme. No one else is out there. His father's 65 miles away. Look what they say. They conspired against him to kill him. You see where their jealousy ended up? Ready to kill. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. So it seems that they hated him for all those reasons, as we said earlier, but the thing that, and the robe represented the father's love for Joseph. But it was the dreams that he shared where he would rule over them, and the coat that he wore that represented the father's love for him. Those were the two things that they were most angry about because they stated. So here comes that dreamer. They said to one another, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Now this is a desert-like area. There's not a lot there. And so there's cisterns. There's pits or cisterns everywhere. He says pits. There's several of them. There's wells there in that land, and there's cisterns where they would hold the rainwater because, it's a hot place most of the year. And so it was a cistern that they threw him in. They said, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. These boys are enraged. How many here in your Christian life have actually had people that hated you? You look at your hand. I was going to say, no, not you. Yeah. Me as well. Many years ago, there was a man that stalked my family. Stalked me. Man, my family. And it was pretty frightening to our family. He was finally caught. I knew him. He used to be a friend of mine. And I'll never forget, because he took the stalking order very lightly. You know, you have restraining orders. Everybody knows what that is. But those are just stalking order. You violate it, you go to federal prison. And I'll never forget going to court one day because he didn't take that threat seriously. He was thrown in jail and arrested, and he was before the judge because he wouldn't stay away from the family. Judge says, you come near the Gallaghers again, I'm going to throw you in federal court, sir. Never seen him again. We moved to a different location. Very smart. He hated us. And it's not comfortable. It's not comfortable, especially when you feel you've been misunderstood and judged and you don't really understand why. Very painful. One of the most painful emotional experiences for a Christian is when there's a misunderstanding in the church and you feel misrepresented. Very painful. That's not what's supposed to happen when we go to church. We're supposed to be encouraged in the Lord. Very, very painful to be misunderstood. So, here you go. I call, what I'm going to do here in a few minutes is I call God intervening providential sightings. Providential sightings. When the Lord shows us his hand through other people, and it cannot be mistaken that the Lord's intervening and with us. Providential sightings. This happens in this book. If you don't remember anything else, remember that it seemed like the harder his life got, the closer the Lord moved in. And there were providential sightings. The first one, so I want you to look for them as I go through this book. Because guess what? Just as the Lord showed up when things got bad for Joseph, he does the exact same for us. And he wants us to see his providential sightings in our life, lest we become hopeless and discouraged. So here's his first one. The man who saw his brothers, who overheard where they went, directed Joseph to go to the exact spot. That's a providential sighting. God's hand is all over that. This is not a coincidence. It's not fate. It's God's work on Joseph's behalf. Okay, let's continue. Verse 20. They said again, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams." Here's the second providential sighting. But when Reuben, that's the older boy, who should be wearing Joseph's robe, but disqualified himself, no doubt, by sleeping with his father's wife. Hello. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let's not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So he's saying, don't kill him now. Let's throw him into the cistern, hoping that later on he would go back and get Joseph out of there to safety. So he had a plan, and I think, or commentators think, that this was one way he was trying to make things right with his father. I ran interference with Joseph. I want to be restored into your favor. And so that was the second providential sighting. He'd have been dead. They would have slaughtered an animal on the spot and killed him on the spot had Reuben not spoke up. And the Lord knew that was going to happen. The Lord knew that he was going to rape his stepmother. The Lord knew that he was going to lose his father's favor. And the Lord knew that he would be the one to intervene on Joseph's behalf. Providential sighting. Let's continue. Verse 23. This is all going on before Joseph gets there. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. They couldn't stand the sight of that robe. And by the way, with guys as angry as these were, I'm sure they didn't mildly take it off his shoulders. They were violent. Joseph's 17. And he has 9 brothers abusing him severely. Can you imagine the fear in that boy's heart? He's looking into his own brother's eyes while they're doing it. And they took him. They listened to Reuben, thank God. They took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. I've always been intrigued by that. I mean, at first first time I ever read it, I thought, well, is that because it was going to be much more of a thud when he hit the ground? Or did they want to throw him in a pit where he wouldn't drown? Nevertheless, I think a pit is a pit. And it's pretty desperate. They threw him into a pit. The next verse could be, I mentioned it last week, verse 25, is possibly one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. Knowing the story, this is another providential sighting. They threw him into a pit. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. I mentioned that last week. Who does that? If you're having a disagreement at the dinner table, I might have mentioned that. If you're having a disagreement at the dinner table, at the breakfast table, the first thing that's supposed to happen is you lose your appetite. These guys throw their brother down the pit to die. They're going to leave him there. And they sat down and ate lunch. Thems are some hard people. You look in their eyes and there's nothing there. Steel, cold eyes. They sat down to eat lunch. But look at the rest of the verse. I love it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they no more sat down to eat their falafel or whatever they had. They no more sat down to eat, that when they looked up, a caravan, at that very moment, a caravan coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh on their way to carry it to Egypt. Joseph's ticket out of the pit The Lord saw him when he was in the pit. The Lord was grieved when he was in the pit. And he no more fell to the ground of the pit. And they looked up, and here comes this rescue. Providential sighting. Now, turn quickly, because I want to show you about his experience, a little inner sight of his experience. Go to chapter 42 real quick. 21. Actually, let's jump up to verse 18. So this is chapter 42, verse 18. And this is when Joseph finally meets his brothers. He's not disclosed his identity to them. They know that he's Potiphar's right-hand man, or Pharaoh's right-hand man. They know that he takes care of all of the food. That's one of his responsibilities during the famine. Isn't that interesting? Who takes care of the food when there's a famine? When Joseph's family is starving, who oversees the food? Their brother. I mean, you see these sightings all the way along. Do you see them in your own life right now? You got to look. You have to be aware. You know the sand, footprints in the sand? Everybody knows the footprints in the sand. For those of you that don't, man died, goes to heaven. He says to the Lord, you know, I notice as I look past my life, I see my footprints in the sand of my life, and I notice that during the most difficult times of my life, there was only one set of footprints there was only one set of footprints. No, I noticed there was two sets of footprints. In the hardest times of my life, there was only two sets of footprints. All the other times were just mine. What is that? Oh, that's right. That's right. Did you hear that? Thank you for helping me with my sermon tonight. Okay. Two sets of footprints through his whole life. The Lord, we know that the Lord is with us always. Two sets of footprints always. Do you feel that tonight he's with you? He is. But his most difficult times, there was only one set. Why? The Lord carried it. Thank you very much. So, chapter 42, verse 18. So, back up again. He hadn't disclosed himself to the brothers, so they don't know it's Joseph yet. But he puts them through some heavy-duty tests to teach them a lesson. Verse 18, on the third day Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the family into your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. He's looking to see his youngest brother, Benjamin. Hasn't seen him in 20 years. Benjamin was probably 5 or 6 when Joseph was taken to Egypt. He wants to see his only full brother. I want to see my younger brother. Bring your youngest brother to me. I heard you talk about him. So your words will be verified. I want you to prove to me you got a youngest brother. The truth of the matter is, I can't wait to see him. And they did so. Now listen to this verse. So Joseph is really hard on him right now. He walks away, and this is what the brothers said, verse 21. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we would not listen. So if you want to know what Joseph went through when they stripped him of his cloak and threw him down in the cistern, That's what he went through. Have you ever been so heartbroken and destitute that you begged someone not to leave or not to do this, and they did it anyway, and sat down and ate lunch? Life could be harsh. Life could be harsh. And the Lord saw that. And the Lord sees the injustices that have happened to us and the injustices that we've done to other people. Let's not forget that. And when he saw that 17-year-old begging his brothers for life, they sat down and looked up. And here comes the merchants. Sometimes we go, Lord, where are you now? I've cried out to you so many times about this. And then other times, as soon as you say amen, the answer's right there. He knows what he's doing. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Now keep in mind, these are not random events. It was prophesied to their great-grandfather, Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham, years earlier, that God would send his people into a dark place for 400 years, and that he would be with them and he would send them to a better place out of Egypt. That was prophesied many years before this. So God's plan continues. How's he going to get him into Egypt if he doesn't start with Joseph? Part of his plan. Providential sighting. Here they come. And look at this. That's not all. Then, verse 26, Judah, one of his other brothers, second in line. Reuben, first brother, lost the coat. Judah takes his place temporarily. Number two brother, he speaks up. And they listen to him. He says, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. I mean, every time this guy gets right on the edge of the cliff, the Lord intervenes. Every time. God does that. Anybody had that happen recently at all? I mean, real recently, where this wasn't supposed to happen and the Lord shut up. Well, I told you last week, just last week, about my sister with dementia, remember? And we didn't know what we were going to do as a family, or how to take care of her, or where to begin, or what call to make, or how to come up with the funds. 52-year-old dementia, my sister. And I told you about that phone call in the coffee shop. I mean, the email I got in the coffee shop, her former boss. I never met the guy. Don't even know if they're Christians. For the rest of this year, we're going to pay full ride for your sister. Get her the care she needs, the Medicaid that she needs, the help that she needs. We'll get her set in a place, and we're paying for everything. Don't even know who he is. That was from June. We felt probably the contract would end December 31st. Just what happened last week? Guess what happened last week after I got done talking to you? We got a phone call. He's going to continue on as long as she's alive. That is a providential sighting. And you have them too. I'm no one special. You have them too. You might be thinking, well, he's not running by my watch, that's for sure. I want to preach a sermon. Well, actually, one of my sermons is about being in God's waiting room, the life of Joseph. And when I teach on that, I always like to say, according to my watch, he runs late. Now, I don't know what you feel about that, but God runs late according to my watch. Man. Then they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. You know, he probably just had a measure of hope and thought, my brothers are relenting. They've changed their mind. I'll be able to see my father again. They drew him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Sound a little familiar to you? Yeah. And then they took Joseph to Egypt. Now we have to imagine this for a moment. He's never lived anywhere other than in his home with his father and his brothers and his mother. He was part of the team that shepherded the flock. We know that he was his father's favorite. We know that his father was protective over him, overly protective to his own shame. But he deeply loved his father. All he was doing was what his father asked. And now he's taken, he's thrown in the back of a cart with big round wooden wheels. And I don't know if you've seen this movie, but this is the image I have. You ever seen Gladiator? Okay. So in Gladiator, they take one of the slaves, Russell Crowe. They took one of the slaves. He had a laceration on his arm. They threw him in the back of this wagon, this cart. And there was a couple of African slaves too. And I'll never remember, he had, pus and blood and this big gash. And they put, what did they put on his wound? What is it? Lice? What is it? They put little maggots. Maggots on his wound because they eat all the infection. And so I picture Joseph in a like a wagon like that, sold like an animal, and they take him away in this cart, and the picture of their brother standing there gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But more than that, I will never see my father again. Never. So the Lord does intervene in and out when we need him to. But it does not mean that we are without affliction and suffering. Don't ever think that that's what the Christian life is summed up to be. And the Ishmaelites weren't friends of the Jews either? From Ishmael. Yeah, enemies. I probably knew he was Jewish too. You could tell. You could tell. They take him to Egypt. Verse 29. Can you imagine how crushed Reuben was, his brother, that had a plan to go get Joseph out of the pit when no one else was there? Boy, he's learning the hard way himself. When Reuben, verse 29, returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, a sign of mourning and intense travail. And returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go? Where shall I go now?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And now here, so we've gone from anger to jealousy, and then chronic, violent lying. And it was one lie on top of another lie that they couldn't get out of. You know, when I was 15 or 16, I didn't meet my father till I was 10, and when I finally met him and he was in my life, I was taking drugs at 15 and 16, and I was doing this and I was doing that, and I lied to him incessantly. And I lied to my father so much that I forgot the last lie I told. But he didn't. I literally forgot the last lie I told and told another one, and then he knew. These brothers were not only murderous, look what they do to their father. I think this must have been their payback to their father. They slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe, Joseph's robe that his father gave him, in blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, listen to this, deviousness. This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. That's called wicked. A fierce animal, it's like one lie after another. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Telling her father. It's like this should teach you never to have favorites, Daddy. Then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. How dare you, sons? How dare you? Rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. And look at this last verse. I just love this last verse. But meanwhile, like back at the ranch, right? Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. And meanwhile, so all of this is coming down on Joseph, but meanwhile actually means that does not tie God's hands and keep him from sovereignly working in our life. I mean, how destitute are some of the situations we're in? I have a family member. This person on paper does not have a prayer of ever knowing the Lord. Not a prayer. I mean, as far and as dark and as vile, and they're proud of it. that they can be. And so you look at someone, you go, there's no hope. There's no way. Joseph has just been sold twice. Not once. Twice. He doesn't know the language. He's never going to see his father again. His brothers betrayed him like they couldn't do in any other way. And now he's taken to a foreign country. He doesn't speak Egyptian. 17. And then, when you read the story, the rest of the story of Joseph, we're going to see, out of all of the biblical heroes, like in Genesis, well, first of all, he's mentioned more than even Moses. Well, Moses was Exodus. That's probably why. He's mentioned more than any other person in the book of Genesis, Joseph. He's given more chapters. And probably, overall, other than the stupidity of being 17, has the cleanest, most righteous record of most biblical heroes. Joseph. Whenever there's a meantime, or whenever we're going through some harsh circumstances where we think God's actually forgotten about us, in the meantime, he's sovereignly, lovingly, providentially working on your behalf and mine. For anyone, family member or friend, that you are concerned about as far as their salvation, it is never to be without hope. I don't care how dark they are. Never to be without hope. Because God, in the meantime, is working behind the scenes of our life, in their life. And so it happened. Lord, tonight, you know the depths of everyone's heart. You know the joy that they feel in their salvation and in your walk with them. But you also know them in their quietest moments, in the midnight hours, when there's restlessness and pain. Will you always bring to mind for us the life of Joseph? I don't think our lives will ever be as dark as his. You never stopped working. We'll find that at the end of the story. So for each one of my friends, Lord, we pray tonight to give them hope, to let them know that you are right with them. And in due time, they will reap a harvest if they trust you and do not give up. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Blessings on you. Thank you for being here. See you next month.